I'd like to share with you some interview prep shortcuts, especially if you're preparing an interview with a high-performing company. And of course, assuming that you want to take these interviews seriously, I'll start with the easy ones, the ones which I often mention on this channel, and then I'll continue with more advanced strategies that, it took me years to develop for these shortcuts. So right from the start, the first shortcut that almost no one's talking about is while preparing for a job interview is to prepare the tell me about yourself or your motivation to join the company last, not first. So in other words, if you want to prepare a story bank, if you want to role play, you can do all this. And then after you are confident in your story bank and your ability to communicate well, then, a few days before your interview, you could also prepare your tell me about yourself and why this company. The reason for saying this is because I know one way that candidates are trying to shortcut their interview prep is to start with your tell me about yourself, when in fact, in my experience, it's a very time-consuming activity with a very limited amount of reward for your time invested, right? The second interview prep shortcut I like to talk about here is links to one's communication skills. Is communication a relative strength of yours? Do you communicate well? Because passing behavioral interview boils down to two things, your story bank and your role play. So if you communicate well, then it means your challenge will be coming up with a story bank. That is your substance. Story banks are notoriously challenging to develop simply because you would have to think about stories on key behaviors, and you would often have to spend a lot of time to write those stories in full. Now, what if I told you that if communication is a strength, then the brainstorming process and the way you keep and store and write your stories could be as bullet points, simply because communication is your strength, and it means you don't need to get into a narrative format because you're already presumed to be good with these things. In my experience, there's a major difference if you bullet point your stories from the start versus developing brain dumps of several pages. Now, not to say that brain dumps aren't useful at all. You should still include in those bullet points all the key and all the relevant details about your stories, but bullet pointing them will be a major shortcut in the process. Now, on the other hand, what if communication is not your strength going into a job interview? So you cannot communicate well, you don't have a story bank going into the job interview. A major shortcut I recommend to you would be that as soon as you get one story, right, your best story, you don't have to brainstorm a lot about these things. Everyone knows their best story or stories. You get that one story and you role play it with someone, ideally with someone who knows what they're doing, an interview coach ideally, because what happens is that if you get one story, your best story, that is ready to interview, you can communicate in such a way that you are confident that that's the right thing. You will build the critical thinking skills required for you to build the subsequent stories for your job interview and to build your story bank, and ideally also the role play in parallel. This is when compared to a strategy that most candidates, especially candidates who lack interviewing skills or communication skills, do, that is to brainstorm for 10 or 20 stories, then you revise those stories, I recommend at least 3 times, which is a very time-consuming process. And then you end up, with maybe not enough time for role play, versus making one story, one great story, which would role play, you would communicate. I know it's going to be slightly uncomfortable, right? But still, that this exercise you can replicate across all your other stories, which in turn will come alive, so to speak, a lot quicker when compared to if you only brainstorm for stories and only then role play them. Right? Now, these were the relatively straightforward ones to understand about behaviors and communication skills. During phone screening rounds, a major shortcut, and also thanks to the AI, is that interview questions during screening rounds are highly predictable. Right? This is something that before AI wasn't a thing. So long story short, what I would suggest, if you prepare for a phone screening round, you don't have to prepare an entire story bank, your role play, and all that stuff, except if you want to improve your interviewing skills for any other subsequent interviews. Okay, but most people don't have time or don't want to invest into these things as early on in the process. So a shortcut here would be to prepare a list of possible interview questions based on your CV, based on the job description you have, based on what others are saying about the role. You could even feed all this information into AI and to determine a list, a definitive list of, 10, maybe 15 at most, interview questions that you want to prepare thoroughly for that phone screening round. Okay, the alternative, would be to go try to look around for as many questions as possible. I don't know, maybe a list of 30 possible questions, you cover as much as possible. Or the other inefficient extreme would be you only prepare 3 questions because you think only 3 questions are possible. So the innovation here is that since they are predictable, you know that if you get 10 or 15 at most, you will get asked those questions primarily during a job interview, so during that screening round. So that's why it's worthwhile shortcutting the system, right? And now let's get to more complex stuff about how do you prepare, assuming you prepare potentially for a final interview, or you want to prepare to become good with behavioral interviews. Becoming good with behavioral interviews, if this is not at all your thing, can take up to 1 year. At some point, I've even seen some online universities presenting a 2-year course to become good with behavioral interviews. So this is serious business. It's not as if, it's a skill that most people could build over the course of a few days or weeks. So when you prepare for a behavioral interview, again, it's about your story bank and some role play. So the traditional way people prepare on story banks would be to look at the company's core competencies and then to prepare stories around those core competencies. The easiest possible example to understand is Amazon's now 16 leadership principles, which can be simplified, to only, maybe 10 for an interview with Amazon, and you would prepare stories on those core competencies. Once you have your stories, you would role play them, and then you're going to go into the interview. The challenge with this process, Amazon's being one of the largest and most successful sales organization on earth, is that when you prepare on their leadership principles, on their core behaviors, you're playing their game, not yours. So basically, when they make a set of rules to prepare their job interviews, it's to their advantage, not necessarily to your advantage as a candidate. So my pitch here is that, for instance, I developed a model of behavioral competencies for the candidates to prepare in job interviews. In other words, I looked what would be the types of questions that would most resonate in behavioral interviews, especially with high-performing companies. And I tried to build a simple model of behavioral competencies that will not take a lot of time for you to prepare. So by simplifying those models of behavioral competencies, around 7, if you ask how many, 7 core behaviors and around 3 or 4 types of commonly asked questions. So by simplifying that pool of possible questions and possible behaviors, that's also a major shortcut that you would want to take to prepare a behavioral interview. Another shortcut which I found over time is that many candidates don't really know where the bar is set. You don't really understand, you're not confident that the type of stories you're sharing are qualitative enough for your behavioral interviews, let's say. And to this, the fix that I came up with as part of my training program, the thing with the behavioral competencies, is that over the years I indexed some of the most interesting stories from my clients, the ones that were successful in their job interviews, and I put them and I shared those in my training programs. The reason why I'm saying this is because what I'm suggesting is not that you take, if you're applying for a PM technical role, you would want to take another technical PM's example as a bar for a behavioral interview. It doesn't work this way. No, what you must understand is that what types of examples from any role would qualify as exceptional answers during job interviews. So basically, when you have those reference points, you would start reasoning by analogy. Hey, you know what, if that candidate as a senior accountant provided this example, which I found amazingly interesting, me as an economist, for instance, I could also provide something on the lines of, or vice versa, a PM with an analyst or with an accountant. It works this way to understand where the bar is in job interviews, so you don't overthink the process. You would get a lot more confidence, and therefore, also a shortcut with these things, right? Of course, two heads are better than one preparing job interviews, but it's, with the cost difference. But it's oftentimes that busy people try to shortcut their interview preps by preparing them with someone such as an interview coach. So there would be the interview training and the interview coaching, which are the two major options, paid options, so to speak, to shortcut these interviews. Right, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.